Alrighty. Welcome to the NATO at 75 Charting a New Course Conference, hosted by the Georgetown Center for Security Studies and sponsored by the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, the BMW Center for German and European Studies, and the European Center for International Affairs. Our programming will begin shortly. Please take a moment to silence any cell phones. And as a reminder, we follow Georgetown University's speech and expression policy, which can be found on the Georgetown Student Affairs website. With the exception of the afternoon keynote, there will be a question and answer portion at the end of each session, during which you may come to the mic stand at the end or middle of the middle aisle and ask questions. Please be sure to phrase your comments in the form of a question, and in the interest of time, we ask that each person be concise and ask only one question. For the question and answer portion of the afternoon keynote with General Cavoli, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, please submit your questions in advance using the QR codes displayed on the screens on either side of the stage. Additionally, we will have several breaks during the day. You are welcome to use the restrooms located on the 4th floor and 1st floor of Healy Hall during these breaks. However, please note the doors will close to Gaston Hall at the beginning of each session. Out of respect for our keynote speakers and panelists, please be sure to return promptly for each session and do your best to minimize distractions. And finally, there are elevators located to the far right of the stairs should you need them. Thank you for joining us today.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah Moeller, and I'm a core faculty member in the Security Studies program here at the Walsh School of Foreign Service. I'm delighted to welcome you all, both those joining us in person here this morning in historic Gaston Hall, as well as those tuning in virtually from around the world to our conference on NATO at 75, Charting a New Course. 75 years ago last week, not too far from where we are meeting now, representatives from 12 North Atlantic countries came together in downtown Washington to affirm their resolve to unite their efforts for collective security and defense and preserve the peace and security of the Atlantic community, an association born of war designed to fortify peace. In the words of Secretary Atchison, who signed the treaty on behalf of the government and people of the United States, the purpose of the North Atlantic Pact was twofold. For those who seek peace, it is a guide to refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. For those who set their feet upon the path of aggression, it is a warning that if it must needs be that offenses come, then woe unto them by whom the offense cometh. This duality of purpose, a desire for peace while being prepared for war, has guided the alliance ever since, peace through security. Indeed, the NATO flag and emblem, featuring a star representing a compass, symbolizes the peaceful purpose of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. As explained by Lord Ismay, the Alliance's first Secretary General, the compass star guides NATO towards peace, while the circle signifies the unity among the Alliance's members. As a political military alliance, NATO is also unique in that its members have pledged not only to uphold the principle of collective defense and guarantee each other's security, but also their shared determination to safeguard the freedom and prosperity of their peoples, a freedom founded on the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. This hybrid political military identity has at times been a source of tension within the alliance. Over the course of the past 7.5 decades, the alliance has often had to navigate the delicate balance between political and military priorities as it sought to fulfill its chief purpose and safeguard the peace, freedom, and security of its members. A tension that persists within the alliance today, and one I'm sure we'll hear more about over the course of the day. Following the end of the Cold War, NATO added two core tasks, crisis prevention and management, and cooperative security, to its original focus on deterrence and defense. And for a brief period, NATO could direct its attention and energies towards out-of-area operations and expeditionary missions, secure in the belief that Europe was whole and free. But history has now caught up with the alliance, and today Russia is once again threatening Europe and the wider Atlantic community. As a consequence, the alliance has returned to its original purpose, deterring and defending the Euro-Atlantic area. At the same time, the alliance faces other threats and challenges, the persistent threat of terrorism, and the growing assertiveness of China, whose ambitions and coercive policies, as the 2022 NATO strategic concept stated, directly challenges the interests, values, and security of the alliance. Along with managing these challenges, NATO must also confront one of the defining issues of our time, the impact of climate change. That's quite a crowded agenda. There have been other significant changes along the way as well. 75 years on from its founding, the alliance is larger than ever, having added 20 additional members in the intervening decades, most recently Sweden last month, and several partner countries like the AP4. And as we'll hear this morning and afternoon, the alliance is not only larger than ever, but it is also actively working on becoming stronger than ever. Navigating the complex and often turbulent waters of today's international security environment, while learning from past experiences and remaining agile enough to adapt to future contingencies, is NATO's central challenge today. Over the course of the day, we'll have the privilege of hearing from many distinguished alliance practitioners and NATO scholars, each offering their unique insights and perspectives on these and other pressing issues. In a moment, we'll have the opportunity to hear directly from the U.S. Permanent Representative to NATO, Ambassador Julianne Smith, who will share her perspective and provide insights on last week's NATO's foreign ministerial meeting, as well as a preview of the upcoming agenda for the July Washington summit. Following her prepared remarks, Ambassador Smith will take questions from the audience in the room. The afternoon keynote address will be delivered by Supreme Allied Commander General Christopher Cavoli, who will also take questions from those in attendance here today. And to facilitate this, we're excited to introduce a new format for audience members to submit their questions in advance. At least it's new for me. The QR code that you see displayed before you on the two screens enables you to submit questions throughout the day ahead of this afternoon's session, ensuring we can incorporate as many questions from the audience as possible during our brief time with Saker Kavoli. I encourage you to make use of this opportunity during the breaks in today's program. Organizing an event of this caliber and size, as I'm sure you can imagine, requires all hands on deck, and there were many individuals who were involved in making today possible. I want to begin by thanking my colleagues from the Security Studies program, especially Professors Stephen Flanagan and Heidi Urban. They have been my guiding North Stars since we embarked on planning this conference nearly 10 months ago. And along the way, they have offered steady direction and been a constant source of advice, for which I'm deeply appreciative. I also want to express my gratitude to Jenna DeFossi and Abby Frameth from the Center for Security Studies, who have done an outstanding job making today a reality, and frankly, they've had to put up with far too many emails from me in the process. I'm also grateful to Professors Daniel Byman and Rebecca Patterson, the Director and Associate Director of the Center for Security Studies, for their support, along with the many staff and student volunteers from the program who are helping here today. Thank you all. I also want to thank the many colleagues from across the School of Foreign Service and the wider Georgetown University community for offering their assistance and support. In particular, I'd like to thank Jackson Menner from Protocol and Events and Jacob Mendel from Event Management Services. Thank you both for all of your work. Finally, I want to extend my gratitude to our Georgetown partners, the Moritara Center for International Studies and the BMW Center for German and European Studies, for their generous financial support for today's programming. It's my pleasure to now introduce Dean Joel Hellman, who will offer a few remarks before introducing our first keynote of the day, Ambassador Julianne Smith. Dean Hellman, the helm is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for all the work you've done in organizing what I know will be a fascinating and I'm sure an important day. I want to welcome you to Georgetown. It seems like a particularly, momentous day because of what we're going to see climactically as well as looking to discuss here in the room. I am going to try to see whether or not the staff can actually get us glasses to look at the eclipse if we have lots of people leaving for about a 15-minute period a little in the afternoon. I don't know if stained glass is also a protective way of looking at the eclipse. But it does feel, it gives this day a little bit more significance. Let me welcome you here for those who have never joined us here on the Georgetown University campus at the School of Foreign Service. Let me tell you a little bit about our school because it is such an honor, a privilege, and indeed for us, very consistent with the mission of why this school was created. You are here at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, which is the oldest school of international affairs in the United States. It was created in 1919 in the immediate aftermath of World War I with a very explicit mission. Our founder, on that very day of inaugurating the school, said, and I quote, "Unprepared as we were for war, we are resolved never to be unprepared for the peace." And for over 100 years, this school has been training generations of leaders, engaging through our scholarship, research, and teaching on the core issues that will preserve the peace, both in the last century and going forward. So it is very much in line with our mission to welcome this discussion on a critical alliance, a critical set of relationships, a critical organization that has worked very much in accordance with this mission to preserve the peace, NATO at 75. We are deeply grateful to be able to host such an extraordinary range of panelists to talk both about the history of NATO, but more importantly, about the future of NATO at such a critical moment. As we all know, NATO has been challenged like never before with an invasion in Europe that was almost unimaginable a few years ago, and yet NATO's resolve has shown to be well beyond the expectations. The unity of NATO, the expansion of NATO, has been true to the very mission by which NATO was created. But there are many challenges ahead, and this is an extraordinary opportunity to dig into those challenges, to understand those challenges, and to begin to set the stage for the next 75 years of NATO's efforts to preserve peace. And with that, we want to begin with someone, of course, who knows these issues from the inside out, as you say. We are so pleased to welcome today Ambassador Julianne Smith. She is, as you know, the U.S. permanent representative to NATO, a position that she took on in November 2021, following a long and distinguished career in multiple positions, both engaging in and analyzing the transatlantic relationship. Prior to this position, she served as a senior advisor to Secretary of State Blinken. Before that, she was the director of Asia and geopolitics programs at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. She was also director of the Transatlantic Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. She also played a number of roles in government. She was acting national security advisor and deputy national security advisor to the Vice President of the United States. She served for 3 years as the principal director for European and NATO policy in the Pentagon, for which she was actually awarded the Secretary of Defense's Medal for Exceptional Public Service. And of course, she has held a variety of positions in research institutes here in Washington and beyond, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the German Marshall Fund, the American Academy in Berlin. So she is uniquely capable of giving us both a perspective on NATO's past and, of course, a glimpse into how the U.S. Is thinking about NATO's future. And we are pleased to moderate this discussion, first in a fireside chat format and then through your questions, to have a truly distinguished member of the International Press Corps, David Sanger. He's the White House and National Security Correspondent for the New York Times, and is one of the organization's most senior writers, having spent 42 years at the New York Times, during which he was associated with a team that has won multiple Pulitzer Prizes. His new book, the fourth book that he is publishing, will come out in April, called, fittingly, New Cold Wars: China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and the Struggle to Defend the West. He's also written 2 other New York Times bestsellers. He's been bureau chief in Tokyo. He was Washington economic correspondent, the White House correspondent during the Clinton and Bush administrations, and indeed the chief Washington correspondent. So we couldn't have a better interlocutor and moderator for this conversation. And with that, it is my pleasure to welcome Ambassador Julie Smith and David Sanger to the stage to begin the day's proceedings. Thank you very much.
I'll leave this here for later. Well, good morning, and thanks for coming out early on a Monday morning, and thank you to Joel for that lovely introduction. It is a real pleasure and an honor to open this conference, NATO at 75, Charting a New Course, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions in a few minutes. For 3/4 of a century, NATO has been a cornerstone of international peace and security, uniting nations in a collective commitment to mutual defense and to our shared values. NATO's success story really is remarkable, and it's one that was by no means preordained. The fact that in 2024, 75 years after it was founded, the alliance is bigger, stronger, and more united speaks to the alliance's adaptability. It speaks to NATO's resilience. But it also speaks to the commitment and the courage of millions of soldiers, sailors, aviators that operate together under the NATO umbrella. But I think it also speaks to the attractiveness of NATO's core values: democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. Now, I don't have enough time this morning here to go through all of NATO's many achievements over the last 7 decades, and there will be several panels throughout the day where folks will be allowed to look at the alliance from different angles. It looks like a superb conference and series of discussions, and I congratulate the organizers. But what I do want to do this morning is I want to walk us through all that has happened inside the NATO alliance over just the last 2 years, since Russia launched its unprovoked war of aggression in Ukraine. These last 2 years have in many ways been transformative, and I don't use that word lightly. I don't think there's a better word to describe what's happened across the NATO alliance since the war started. And I think they've showcased time and time again NATO's agility and its innovation. So let me walk you through 5 big changes that we've seen again just in the last 2 years. First, after many, many years of focusing on expeditionary operations, or you'll remember in the 1990s, they were often referred to as out-of-area operations, the alliance has come home and returned to its core mandate of collective defense. And it's taken a series of dramatic steps to enhance its deterrence. Before the war even started, NATO allies were moving force posture into Eastern Europe. You'll remember that NATO, just a few months after the war started, announced 4 new multinational battalions on the eastern flank that were paired with the 4 that were created in the 3 Baltic states and Poland right after Russia went into Crimea in 2014. At the Vilnius summit last year, the alliance also rolled out new regional plans that provide clarity to all allies in terms of what's required to protect every inch of NATO territory. We're also working on an entirely new command and control structure, which I suspect General Cavoli will talk about in his remarks later today. And we just finished conducting our largest military exercise since the Cold War, Steadfast Defender, with 90,000 NATO troops. And that exercise, for the first time in a long time, enabled us to exercise North American troops moving across the Atlantic and into Europe to defend NATO territory. So that's point number 1, dramatic shift, or a coming home of sorts, to collective defense and enhanced deterrence. Secondly, burden sharing has increased significantly in recent years. You'll remember that in 2014, all allies pledged to spend 2% of their GDP on their own national defense. That pledge was to last 10 years. That brings us to 2024. When we started the pledge 10 years ago, we had 3 countries in the alliance spending 2% of GDP on defense. And by last count, we don't know where we're going to end up by the end of this calendar year, but right now we have 20 allies that are meeting the 2% pledge. 20 allies. That is a significant increase over a decade. Of course, we want it to be all 32, and we're going to keep pushing until we get there. But the movement that we saw over the last 2 years, particularly by countries like Germany, that put an extra 100 billion euros on the table for their own defense after the war started, speaks volumes about where we are on the subject of burden sharing. But when we talk about burden sharing, it's not just about 2% of GDP spending on national defense. Burden sharing also takes us to the question of Ukraine. And here, we're also seeing a remarkable level of burden sharing across the alliance. The United States, over the last 2 years, has provided roughly $74 billion worth of support to our friends in Ukraine. Our European allies collectively have provided somewhere around the order of $110 billion worth of support to Ukraine. Every single member of the alliance is providing assistance to Ukraine: economic, humanitarian, and security assistance. So burden sharing is something that we have seen, an area where we have seen tremendous positive shifts just over the last 2 years. Third, NATO has added 2 new members. You'll remember right after the war started in the spring of 2022, there was a knock at the door and 2 countries that had hundreds of years of non-alignment decided to shift their national policy and request formal NATO membership. Not in 5 years, not in a decade, not in 2 years, but immediately. They wanted to start the process immediately. As you well know, Finland became an official member last spring, and Sweden just joined officially and now has taken its seat at the table just a couple of weeks ago. And those 2 allies are already making many meaningful contributions to the alliance each and every day. Number 4, NATO rolled out a new strategic concept in 2022. This is nothing new. NATO rewrites the strategic concept, its core mission statement, about once a decade. What was new about this particular strategic concept was that in addition to mentioning the 2 core threats that the alliance is facing, Russia and terrorism, for the first time in NATO's history, the strategic concept mentions the PRC, challenges associated with the PRC for NATO member states, and the importance of deepening our partnerships with our friends in the Indo-Pacific. Now, why is NATO doing this? Does it have aspirations to become a global alliance and add new members in the Indo-Pacific? Absolutely not. That's not the plan. Our Indo-Pacific partners don't have an interest in joining the alliance, and the alliance is not looking to go global. But what we see is increased utility in working together with our friends in the Indo-Pacific on a number of shared security challenges that really have no geographic boundaries. Disinformation, malicious cyber attacks, or emerging and disruptive technology. We view these security challenges increasingly in one theater and not limited to just the Atlantic or the Pacific. And so NATO is moving out, while it's focused on the war in Ukraine, it is moving out to deepen these important partnerships with our friends in the Indo-Pacific to share best practices and insights on those shared challenges. Finally, NATO, while it has been addressing the challenges in Ukraine and coping with the Russian threat, has taken a series of unprecedented steps to address a wide range of emerging and future challenges. And I'll give you a couple of examples. We have new initiatives across the alliance in 2 new domains, cyber and space. You'll remember when NATO was created, we focused on land, sea, and air. And now increasingly, the alliance is moving out to focus on security threats that exist in cyberspace and in space proper. NATO also recently announced a €1 billion innovation fund to protect our collective technological edge. NATO is in the process of building something called the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, which has the handy name of Diana, to solve critical defense challenges both with the private sector and with academic institutions. We have expanded our work across the NATO alliance on climate security, but also resilience. We've identified 8 key areas, such as our telecommunication networks, our health systems, or continuity of government, that must remain resilient in the face of any potential attacks. And last summer, we just announced something called the Defense Production Action Plan to ensure that NATO has the industrial capacity and the capabilities that it needs to support its defense plans. So taken together, what does all of this mean for this alliance? The enhanced deterrence, the new resourcing we're seeing, the new members that are still trying to join this alliance, the deeper partnerships with our friends in the Indo-Pacific, and all of the new initiatives that we're rolling out to cope with future challenges. Well, it tells us that at 75, this alliance remains relevant, it remains resilient, and it remains ready for the future. And that's why we look forward to hosting this year's anniversary summit right here in Washington, D.C., July 9th through 11th, where we will no doubt celebrate 75 years of historic achievements, our strong transatlantic bond, and NATO's vital importance in defending against future threats. Now, in addition to the celebration, we of course will be spending a lot of time at the summit focused on Ukraine. I can't predict, none of us can, with any certainty what the war will look like come July. But here's what we do know. All 32 heads of state will be traveling to Washington, D.C. in July to showcase their unwavering unity, their unwavering resolve in helping Ukraine win. We will send a strong signal to President Putin that he can't wait us out. We're not distracted, that we're not looking away, and we may remain focused on Ukraine's immediate and future security needs. And we will take concrete steps at the summit to move Ukraine closer to the alliance and build a bridge to NATO membership. And of course, in addition to Ukraine, the alliance will be making a series of new announcements on many of the subjects I just mentioned. We're rolling out new initiatives as it relates to cyber, to resilience, to climate security, and yes, defense production as well. So let me close just with this. Sometimes I encounter folks that wonder whether NATO's 75 years, whether or not that's some sort of liability. And I have a very short answer on those types of questions. NATO's 75 years of experience, that is not a liability, that is an asset. 75 years of working towards consensus with our closest allies day after day on NATO's core mandate and our future mandates has made unity our greatest strength. Yes, working with 31 other allies day in and day out does have its challenges. It's not always easy to get 32 nations to agree around the table. But when allies put their full weight behind an issue or a position or a new initiative, there's no question that it has both regional and global implications. I think Madeleine Albright, formerly a professor here, of course, and our first female Secretary of State, said it best when she said, "We know that when the democracies of Europe and America are divided, crevices are created through which forces of evil and aggression may emerge. But when we stand together, there's no force on earth more powerful than our solidarity on behalf of freedom." And that's it right there. It's our solidarity, the solidarity that makes NATO stronger and has made NATO one of the most successful alliances in history, and one that has made the alliance ready for tomorrow's challenges. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Smith. Thank you, everyone, to be here. Just so you, I'm David Sanger from the New York Times, and just so that you understand the order of the next few minutes, Ambassador and I are going to talk for about a half an hour, and then we're going to go out to questions for everybody. There are a couple of microphones lined up, or at least one I see here, where you can stand for your questions. So thank you for this. Thanks for coming
Thank
all
you.
the way from Brussels.
Yeah.
It's great to see you again. In a previous life, we had offices next to each other.
Indeed.
But it was hard to imagine then that you'd be ambassador to NATO. I'm still doing the same thing I was doing. So let me start with your comments about what it is that we've learned in the past 2 years, because it has been an extraordinary moment for NATO. And I think you summarized it well, that there were years, decades really, where they were doing expeditionary out-of-area operations.
Right.
There was a lot of debate within NATO. Is this really what we were created for? There was some debate, do we need NATO anymore? There were my favorite conversations that I dug up when I was working on New Cold Wars, the book that you heard referenced before. The internal discussions mostly in the Bush administration, about whether you could bring Russia into NATO. And the Russia-NATO Council gave them an office inside the NATO headquarters. I think that's gone.
It is gone.
Yeah,
It is
yeah.
gone.
So that takes you to the question of what we have learned, what we were surprised by and what we've learned. So you gave us some of the great strengths that they've come together. There are three things that strike me that took NATO by surprise, and I wanted to run through them because it will give us a sense of how they've reacted. In the opening days of the war, or in the run-up to the war, I should say, a lot of European leaders, even the weekend before the war at the Munich Security Conference, were telling me, we're telling you, we're telling Secretary Blinken, the Russians are just bluffing. They're not really going to do this. Their economic interests are so great in providing gas and oil, they would never take this risk. Sure, he's just trying to get a negotiated solution. What lessons have emerged from the fact that while the United States provided the intelligence and the Europeans believed the intelligence, they didn't believe our assessment of the intelligence?
Yeah, you're right. This was an interesting time for me because I was confirmed in November of 2021, and that was right in the thick of, I think it was early fall 2021, when we had taken, the Biden administration had taken this decision to share an unprecedented amount of intelligence with our closest allies, to read them into what we thought was a clear indication that they weren't just bluffing. This wasn't just posturing. They were preparing to go to war. And so I landed in Brussels in late that November, late 2021. And I frankly didn't quite know what to expect. I guess my assumption going in was that with the United States putting this information on the table, the debates would shift and that we would all then sing from the same song sheet. But in fact, what happened is exactly what you're describing. There were many allies around the table that were saying, come on, we hear what you're saying, we appreciate the fact that you've shared this level of intelligence with us many times, not just in one instance, but we were keeping the allies
You were
abreast.
beginning to make it public because they were calling reporters
That's right.
in as well.
That's right. Yeah, no, and we were making it public, absolutely. It wasn't just with our closest allies. But then one of my most vivid memories is when the phone rang on February 22nd at 3 a.m. It kind of felt, we always talk about the 3 a.m. phone call in the United States. It literally rang around that time, and we went in for the emergency North Atlantic Council meeting. Before the meeting got started, one of my colleagues from Eastern Europe raised his hand. And before we were going to launch into a series of steps, we were activating NATO's graduated response plans and activating the NATO response force, flurry of activity. He said, I just need to say, put his head out, looked down the table at me and said, I didn't believe you.
Yeah. Secretary Blinken has said similar.
But sorry, so what? But what that did. So the fact that tragically, Russia decided to go forward with this war. There were several diplomatic efforts. You'll remember the trips to Geneva. There was the NATO-Russia Council at NATO headquarters on January 12th with Grushko around the table at the North Atlantic Council. So we had made efforts to encourage them to take another path. They did not. The war starts. There was a shift inside the alliance in that there was suddenly a different approach and attitude towards U.S. intelligence after that moment. It had created a situation where the U.S. had built up a considerable amount of credibility because we had shared the intelligence, called it out, and tragically it had come to pass. That from that moment forward, as the U.S. continued to share intelligence about Russian plans, what their strategy, what was happening on the ground, and what we envisioned would be next steps, then then you could see the Allies' attention and focus on what was being presented by US briefers. So there was a significant shift from one day to the next across the alliance.
Do you think it was all lasting? In other words, do you think now the intel between the US and the other NATO members, the agreement on assessment has fundamentally changed?
I think it's fundamentally changed, and the changes that we saw 2 years ago are still ever present today inside the NATO alliance in terms of the seriousness with which allies look at and consider US intelligence.
There were two other areas that jumped out at me from my reporting on this period, one in the oldest of tech and one in the newest. Europe had pretty much stopped making conventional ammunition of the artillery shells of the kind you've seen fired. And the Ukrainians, while the US and Microsoft and Amazon World Services and others did a fabulous job moving the Ukrainian government to the cloud, there had been no planning for how they were going to communicate to the cloud. Now, Elon Musk stepped in and solved this one, but that was not part of the plan. So I'm wondering if you can just sort of bring us up to date on both the ammunition side and the communications cyber side of this.
Yeah, so, sorry, desperately need some caffeine here. So two things. First and foremost, on what was happening in Europe before the war and post-war. So one of the hardest lessons, I think, of the war in Ukraine for the NATO allies is a deeper appreciation and understanding of the brittleness of the transatlantic defense industrial base and some of the shortages that we were seeing because of an aging and kind of shrinking workforce across that defense industrial base. And so what we thought were NATO standards that would enable us all to have the stocks necessary to cope with any potential contingency, I think Ukraine opened our eyes to the reality that first and foremost, we needed to have a lot more on hand, but also that we needed to open up those production lines that we had shuttered many, many years ago and rethink about how we're still in the process of doing this, backfill the shortages that now exist across the alliance because of the critical assistance that's been provided to our friends in Ukraine. So that defense production piece is front and center for us as a transatlantic project. We've seen some remarkable steps forward in just 2 short years, but my goodness, we have a lot more work to do ahead of us. Let me just cite one amazing example, the Czechs. The Czechs used to produce about 10,000 155s per year. They are now, 2 years later, producing 100,000 155s annually. So that's one example. There's many more. What Rheinmetall has done in Germany over the last year or so has also been impressive. We've done a lot to increase production here in the United States, especially on ammunition, but frankly, across many systems. But on Ukraine, the Ukraine piece of it, there's a very an interesting set of different lessons that we've learned from them and we're learning in real time, and that is this war with Russia that the Ukrainians are in the middle of defending their territory has brought emerging tech into what sometimes feels, and I know General Milley has this great quote that's in your book, that it's trench warfare. It feels not like World War II. There's an element of that with tanks rolling back and forth, but the trench warfare really brings us back to World War I, and yet the Ukrainians are pairing new technology and drones. They're using apps, swipe right for more ammunition. I mean, it's unbelievable what the Ukrainians have done in terms of attaching new technology to basically Soviet legacy equipment. So on that side of things, yes, they're feeling now the pinch and the shortfalls that exist in Europe and in the United States, but they've also continued to innovate throughout the war and use technology to their advantage. And that's why NATO just recently created this something called JTAC, which is going to allow us to work with the Ukrainians and extract lessons learned on how they are fighting the Russians. What does modern day combat with the Russians actually look like? No one knows that better than our friends in Ukraine right now. And how it has pieces of a sci-fi movie, and yet it also has pieces of World War I conventional warfare.
It's interesting that you say that. And in fact, I was going to ask you, and you had it right, about the Milley quote. He's colorful, and I'll cut out a little bit of the colorful wording. Because as he always says, he speaks Army as his first language. But he said, trench warfare. For a while, we thought this would be a cyber war. Then we thought it was looking like an old-fashioned World War II tank war. And then there are days when I thought they were fighting World War I.
Exactly.
And the fact of the matter is, I mean, I said this in my words, not his, it is part 1914, part 1941, and part 2024.
Completely. So, that's exactly it.
Is NATO now, does it have its head around that alteration in that you are doing something that mixes these 3 years?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, first and foremost, we're obviously working to extract those lessons learned and what it means for the alliance. We're increasing production. We have thought increasingly about how NATO standards need to continue to drive and send signals to defense industry. You know, if NATO says, for example, let me pick a random number, NATO mandates that all members must have, let's say, 30 days of ammunition, and then suddenly says not 30 days, 6 months, a year, 3 months, whatever it is, and dramatically increases what the NATO standard is that all allies have to meet, it obviously then sends the right signal to industry that, hey, this has a future and it merits reopening these old lines. Because the answer you get from defense industry so often now when we pound on their doors and say, please produce more and faster, both for our own stocks and for our friends in Ukraine, they often say, well, you need it right now. Will you need it next year? And we've seen this movie before where NATO allies think they need a certain capability and then they back off it or they pivot to something else, or planning dictates a different set of requirements. And so we're trying to take a long, hard look at what those NATO standards are, particularly as we refill our stocks based on the assistance we've provided, but then to send the right signals that this will be a lasting project for the alliance. The way we see it, this will be, the defense production piece of it will be, over the next decade, we're going to be working on not only ensuring that we have the stocks necessary to counter any potential threat, but to backfill and continue to get the Ukrainians what they need.
So this is expensive. What you were describing.
Indeed.
And I know you were celebrating the 2% marker for 20 of the 32 countries, but that 2% marker was set 10 years ago.
Correct.
And I just spent, as you know, a couple of months in Berlin and spent some time with the German defense officials about their plans to do exactly what you've just described. And while the plans are impressive, you can't do it for the 72 billion euros a year that they spend on defense. Hard for me to say this with any accuracy, but I have my doubts whether you could do it for twice what they're spending. And yet the political conversation in Europe, including in Germany, has not caught up with the cost of doing what you've just described.
Yes, there's good news and bad news.
Good news is we're hitting 2%. Bad news is 2% won't do it anymore.
Well, it's interesting. If you go back and look at the language from the Vilnius summit last summer, what did we say about 2%? We said that it is a floor, not a ceiling. And we said that because increasingly, when we look at what's going to be required for the future, we increasingly believe that additional resources above and beyond every country hitting 2% are going to be needed. And Secretary Austin has been clear about that. No doubt General Cavoli will mention it again later today. And what are we seeing in Europe? We're seeing countries now stretch to 3%. We have a number of countries that are already at 2.5. Not just the Baltic states, by the way, Romania, some of our friends in the Nordic countries. I mean, a whole array of countries now are looking at 3%, and the polls are talking about 4%. Now, obviously, with the polls, because they're right there on the edge of what's happening in Ukraine, they feel this war in ways others maybe don't feel it so acutely. But it is a conversation that is occurring across the alliance day in, day out about whether or not, even when we all hit 2%, whether or not that will be sufficient. Because you're right to point out that not only to do the backfill work that we have to do, but to prepare for all contingencies, including in some of those new areas that I mentioned, it's going to require resourcing.
So the bill in Congress right now, the $64 billion, if you get it, still an if, much of the ammunition, as I read that bill, is just going to backfilling for things we've already given them. It wouldn't actually result in more ammo going immediately to the Ukrainians. Is that
It's
right?
both. It's both. And that's why we have to get the supplemental done. It's absolutely critical that we get this through Congress. The Ukrainians need this support desperately. They need to have U.S. continued leadership. They need these resources. We want to make sure that they don't go into the summer rationing their ammunition or facing any unnecessary shortfalls. We want to put them in the best position possible to face
Well, they are already
any
rationing ammunition, aren't
They are rationing. There are some shortages currently that they are grappling with. And I very much hope, we all hope, that that supplemental will get through no later than the end of this month.
So let's talk for a moment about something you raised at the end of your discussion, which is the delicate dance about how you talk about admitting NATO eventually, admitting Ukraine eventually into NATO. No secret, there's big division within the NATO alliance on this. The Eastern Europeans are pretty clear, and we're clear in Vilnius. They want them in basically now. The President and Chancellor Scholz were basically the two leaders who were most vocal on the question that you cannot admit a country while it is in the midst of war. And it sounds, from what I'm hearing, like they want to take the wording they used in Vilnius, which is vague about when Ukraine would get admitted, and move very similar wording forward for the 75th anniversary. President Zelensky came in pretty hot to the Vilnius meeting after this, if you read his tweets, as all of you were. Tell us how you're managing this.
Well, look, in Vilnius, we did a lot. We came together. It wasn't easy. It had some challenges. Allies have different perspectives on this, as you noted. But we did come together and we did a couple of things. First and foremost, we said to the Ukrainians, there's no question about membership. You will become a member of this alliance. Your future place is in NATO, and we will continue to work to get there. We also made clear that there are a number of reforms that they need to undertake to be granted full-fledged membership, and that's a challenge that all aspirants have faced. And they are making good progress. And in fact, we just had Secretary Blinken in Brussels last week, and we were able to get a report from the Ukrainians on all that they're doing on their governance and security reforms. And it's an impressive list for a country in the middle of a war to continue to make progress, for example, on anti-corruption, is extremely admirable. So we applaud those efforts, and we want to encourage them to keep going. But we also, in addition to basically saying to them, look, NATO will agree to full-fledged membership for Ukraine when conditions are met and when allies agree, and that holds for this summer summit.
And when the war ends.
Right.
Or is at least at a stopping point.
Exactly. But what we did do is we created the new NATO-Ukraine Council, where Ukraine comes in and sits as an equal around the table and is able to share firsthand impressions and insights from the war. We can hear what their requirements are, but we can also talk about a variety of other subjects. We've had meetings of the NATO-Ukraine Council on attacks on critical infrastructure. We've talked to them about cyber attacks and looked for ways to provide additional assistance. But we did another important thing last year, and that was to lift MAP, the membership action plan that many new members have gone through, which can be a bit of a lengthy process. We removed that entirely and said, you will not have a membership action plan. You will proceed towards a session when the timing is right. So your question is, well, what are you going to do this summer on top of what you already did last summer if membership isn't on the table? And there, we will have a concrete deliverable for Ukraine. I can't get into the full details of that at this juncture, but we're working on a way to get them on what we're calling a bridge to membership by deepening NATO's work with the Ukrainians on questions of interoperability, on modernization, providing additional resources to our friends in Ukraine, and institutionalizing some of the bilateral support that has been provided to date.
You mentioned cyber. Before the war broke out, several years before the war broke out, NATO agreed that a major cyber attack on a member would constitute something that could trigger Article 5. Tell us a little bit about what you have seen the Russians doing, both how they're using cyber inside Ukraine, where at moments the cyber attacks and the kinetic attacks seem timed together, and what you're seeing outside of Ukraine, where I think we had probably expected a more active Russian attack surface in the NATO nations. We've seen some, but not dramatically higher than the background noise of normal cyber conflict.
Well, I guess the way I would describe that is it has, in essence, been a steady state. The Russians, this is one of their favorite tools of the variety of hybrid tactics on which they regularly rely. Malicious cyber attacks is a play that we've seen them rely on time and time again. Obviously, to have an impact inside Ukraine, on the battlefield, with the Ukrainian public, to create political, strategic dilemmas for President Zelensky, to drive disinformation. They also use disinformation on a regular basis as well. But cyber security and cyber attacks is a regular part of what we cope with across the alliance. It's ever present. It's not just up and down the eastern flank. I'd be hard pressed to find an ally that hasn't dealt with some sort of cyber attack in the last couple of years. And oh, by the way, the amount of learning that's happening between the PRC and Russia in this space is staggering. Those two actors increasingly learn from each other and rely on that cyber instrument to divide the NATO alliance from within, to divide Europe from the United States, to create vulnerability. Well, InfoWars, but also cyber attacks on our government structures, on secure systems, on what the Ukrainians are doing on the battlefield. So what is NATO doing about it? NATO started first and foremost with protecting its own networks. That was project number one, and declaring cyber a new domain, which happened in 2016, as you noted. And then from there, last year, we built a virtual cyber response capability under which an ally that is under attack can knock on NATO's door and say, what's available here in terms of, I need forensics help, I need help patching a system, I've got part of my government that's offline, what can NATO provide me on the fly? And there we have this virtual response, kind of almost like a Chinese menu of, a whole array of options that you can hand to an ally and say, this is available to you today.
Have you enacted this and made use of it?
Well,
so far?
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't want to get into details about that, but yeah, we've put it to good use. And now at this summit, what we're also going to be focused on, we're going to have 4 or 5 new cyber deliverables at the Washington summit. We're working on building better capacity at the national level across the alliance. As you know better than anyone, we have NATO members that are best in class when it comes to preventing, deterring, detecting cyber attacks, and we have allies that are catching up. And so we want to bring the capacity of all allies up to the same level when it comes to counter defense.
Of your NATO members, the US and Britain have pretty extensive offensive cyber capability, have written about it over many years. Do you envision NATO having an offensive cyber capability as well?
We're not talking about that at this juncture.
Okay. Let's turn a little bit. You raised the Chinese cooperation with the Russians in cyber, but obviously it's much broader than that. I would say one of the surprises of this era is that the partnership without limits, that turned out to have some limits, that was announced by President Xi and President Putin, is one of the major dynamics of superpower conflict now. It's also what Nixon and Kissinger spent decades or years anyway trying to avoid. That was the motivation for the opening to China, or a major one. 2 years into this, because that was announced at the Olympics or just before the Olympics.
That's right, yeah.
Prior to the invasion in 2022. How do you assess the level of Chinese and Russian cooperation? And I guess I'll throw the Iranians in as well, because obviously they've been providing a lot of battlefield help, drone help to the Russians.
Yes, and let's not forget DPRK as well. I mean, the amount of assistance that the DPRK has provided to their friends in Russia has also had a major impact on the
You're talking mostly artillery, a little bit of missiles.
Yeah. So you've got
And you
the
think
Iranians
you think it's
providing.
had a major impact?
I think it has had an impact. Why don't we leave it there? And certainly something that the allies increasingly talk about. But this brings us back to the theme that I mentioned earlier. Why does NATO invest so much, or why is NATO investing so much right now in these partnerships with Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand? Because we have so much to learn from one another about what the DPRK is doing to support Russia in this moment. We can talk about the PRC, not direct lethal support, but there's an indication that they're providing some sort of material support through dual-use components. And we talk a lot about that across the alliance and with our Indo-Pacific partners. And then, of course, as you noted, the Iranian piece as well, where they've provided a whole array of very effective lethal drones to their friends.
The U.S. has been doing a lot to try to, and its allies, to try to interrupt that supply chain for the drones, sanctions of many kind and so forth. How effective is that being? Do you think that there's been any impact on the Iranian ability to produce? I know they're now trying to produce Iranian factories in Russia.
Yeah, we do believe that there has been an impact. I mean, it's an ongoing project for the transatlantic partners. The sanctions piece obviously isn't handled by the NATO alliance, and I'm sure Mark Gittenstein, our ambassador to the European Union, could get up here and tell you why the last 2 years have also been incredibly transformative for the US-EU relationship because of what's happened in Ukraine. The amount of work that we've done with the European Union on sanctions, on support for our friends in Ukraine has also been just absolutely remarkable. But back to your question about the PRC and Russia, we do find ourselves across the alliance increasingly grappling with this question of how do we draw attention, each of us bilaterally in our relationship with the PRC, to call them out on this material support, to apply pressure not to continue to provide that kind of support, and make sure that they understand the consequences if they continue down this path. And I think it's been a very effective area of work for all the transatlantic partners. We're seeing many countries across Europe be much more forthcoming in calling out the Chinese for this no limits partnership with Russia, but also for their political support to what Russia's doing in Ukraine and that material support that I just mentioned.
The core of the NATO security guarantees since NATO's creation 75 years ago has basically been the American nuclear deterrent. And yet we have seen in the past 2 years a revival of nuclear threats that are worrisome. I describe in the book the scare in October of 2022 when you and your colleagues were quite concerned. In fact, some of your colleagues said 50-50 chance that Russia would detonate a nuclear weapon a battlefield nuclear weapon in Ukraine. First, tell us a little bit about how that experience may have been transforming for the NATO members. Were they as fully aware as the US was of the nature of this threat? And then let's talk a little bit about how it may be changing the way NATO's thinking about nuclear strategy.
Well, yeah, so a couple of things on that. First, when we rewrote the strategic concept in 2022, you see when you read the document, I mean, nuclear deterrence remains the backbone of NATO's deterrence policy, no question. And our wording on that is very, very clear. As long as nuclear weapons exist, NATO will remain a nuclear alliance. So that's not going anywhere, and the language on that, I think, was crystal clear. But I think you're right to point out that with the war in Ukraine and all of this nuclear saber rattling that we've seen on the part of President Putin, we now have gotten into kind of almost a review of what nuclear deterrence involves, what it means. We're working day in, day out to raise what we call our nuclear IQ. It's like dusting off, I mean, just the whole theory of deterrence, I would say, came back to the forefront when the war started. And we were back right where NATO started 75 years ago. So obviously, we take what Putin says seriously, and the US was able to share more with our allies to help them understand what we were seeing. But honestly, it's what Putin has been saying that's gotten everyone's attention. He's been very public about this. Medvedev has been very outspoken on the potential use of tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And not as much recently, but you're right, in the early stages of the war, we heard a lot about the potential use of tactical nuclear weapons. And so you can imagine what the reaction was around the alliance. We were deeply concerned. At the same time, I think the US made it very clear publicly, but also privately with our closest allies, that we didn't see any clear indication that the Russians were actually preparing to use nuclear weapons. Not then, not now. And so we take this nuclear saber rattling seriously. We continue to monitor the situation. We're in close contact with all of our allies up and down the eastern flank that obviously are gravely concerned about this prospect. But we have also reassured our allies about what we were seeing, whether or not we were seeing any signs of weapons being moved closer to the border, but also just the need to continually warn the Russians that there would be serious, I think Jake Sullivan said, catastrophic consequences should Russia opt to do so.
Well, that October 2022 period, which President Biden compared to the Cuban Missile Crisis at a fundraiser in New York. If you always want to hear him at his most candid, you get the fundraisers. Was a pretty searing moment. I mean, they did not move any nuclear weapons, as you say. They did hear commanders discussing the possibility, and that made a big difference. A last question for you as we think out about the summit that is coming forward. There are the assurances that you can put on paper. There are the capabilities that you can build, and you've described to us how you're doing that. But the political atmosphere makes a big difference to allies' conviction that the US would be there should they need to invoke Article 5. You've heard what one candidate said publicly about what he would do if somebody hadn't paid up. I assume he meant, but it's hard to know, the 2% bit. But separate and apart from candidate Trump's, arguments, there is in Europe today, in part because of our own hesitance in passing the Ukraine bill and all that, a questioning about whether or not the political body of the United States is as committed to NATO as it was before. The Republican Party has several prominent members who have expressed their doubts, both about aid to Ukraine and some about NATO. They may be just voicing noise out here, and I suspect the majority of the party still has its old views. This must be a problem that both drives you crazy and you can't do anything about, because all you can do is work on the capability side, not on the political will side.
Well, that's not entirely true. I think it's on all of us, those of us that work on NATO issues, to continue to make the case. And last year I traveled throughout my home state of Michigan, to have conversations with the governor, with a variety of student groups. I went to both University of Michigan, Michigan State. I was able to do talk radio, do a lot of outreach to try and answer those questions about why do we still have the NATO alliance and why should we keep supporting Ukraine. And I'm heading off to Ohio tomorrow to do the same thing. So some of it's out of my control, and I was sure you were going to ask this question, but here's what I say when I get this question frequently. So there's two concerns about the United States that you hear on the other side of the Atlantic. One is, are you going to get the supplemental done, or is U.S. support for Ukraine over? Is it now on us? Will Europeans have to take over and provide the remaining assistance to Ukraine? And two, can we count on 7 more decades of U.S. presidents of all political stripes standing up and committing and supporting the NATO alliance? And I think my answer on both fronts is pretty optimistic. One, I think we have visitors coming through from Congress almost every week, delegations that are made up of Republicans and Democrats traveling together, and all I hear from them time and time again is, we're going to get the supplemental done. We need to continue funneling support. There's a broad base of support in the House, in the Senate. It's bipartisan to continue supporting Ukraine. There are members in the House, we all know, that are skeptical, don't want to see the supplemental go through, but by and large, when that vote comes to the floor, we're confident that we're going to get it
to the
through.
floor, you think?
Have to get it to the floor. That's the challenge. Two, on broad U.S. support for the alliance, I'll say public opinion data, actually the most recent poll that came out, shows that U.S. support for the NATO alliance is up. It seems that folks increasingly understand why this alliance serves U.S. interests and why it serves our allies' interests, and that bumper sticker that we say a lot, stronger together, isn't just a bumper sticker, it's the truth. Coping with Ukraine is something we need to do with 50 other countries around the world in terms of providing valuable security assistance. Coping with instability elsewhere in the world requires us to work with our closest allies and partners. It's not just Ukraine. So I think fundamentally Americans understand the value of alliances and the importance of the NATO alliance in particular. But also I'll say, when I travel around the United States and encounter Americans in places far away from Washington, D.C., I think, again, there is this kind of bipartisan support that it's NATO is not a partisan issue. I mean, it always, I suppose, has the risk of going in that direction, like any foreign policy subject. But from where I sit right now, whether I'm traveling across the United States or engaging with delegations in Congress or doing press interviews with talk radio outlets, I mean, I think NATO enjoys a privileged place in American foreign policy that, by and large, the majority of Americans understand why it was created and why it's still relevant 70 years later. And that's what we're going to be trying to do at the summit this summer.
Great. Well, if people would like to line up, and I think what we're going to do is probably take 2 questions at a time since our time is short. The ambassador revealed in the course that the depth of her diplomatic skills, that she went to both Michigan and Michigan State doing this.
Outreach, yes, for my outreach speeches. Yes, I didn't study at both.
No, I understand that.
But now it's nice to be
even
here.
just attending the 2, for a day tells you of your skills here. Okay, why don't we take the first 2 questions here?
Thank you. Jason Davidson from the University of Mary Washington and the Atlantic Council. Last week, the Secretary General confirmed that at the Washington Summit, the alliance will put forward its first southern flank strategy. Now, some people would look at that and say, well, the alliance has a really big problem on its eastern flank, so why is it messing around on the southern flank? So could you say a little bit about why the alliance and why the United States should care about the southern flank of the alliance, and what specifically you would like to see in the southern flank strategy at the Washington Summit?
Great, and we'll take the one right behind you.
Hi, thank you for an interesting discussion and raising the points on sanctions. I was wondering when you came to the point of the sanctions effectiveness. So actually, when we talk about sanction effectiveness, it comes to my mind, and we do research also on how effective sanctions are about evasion, because Russia is evading sanctions with the use of many, many countries, especially like from the former Soviet bloc, like Central Asia, Caucasus, and China. What is the philosophies that you have, and how is addressed at the NATO level and maybe at the U.S. government level? My name is Nurul Arkimbek, and I'm from Center of Political and Global Strategies. Thank you.
Great. So let me start with the South. It was a good question. We have kind of a phrase that we use around the NATO alliance, that we have a 360-degree approach, which means that the alliance is not exclusively focused on the North Atlantic or its southern flank or its eastern flank, that we simultaneously try to take on all of those areas. And those new regional plans that I mentioned in my remarks actually divides all NATO territory into 3 different regions, and there is a region, General Cavoli can say more about this, that has very detailed plans for NATO South on how to defend against any potential forms of instability or any attack on NATO's southern flank. But there is a question on the table, and that is, while the alliance is focused on the war in Ukraine, what more can the alliance be doing to address some of the potential challenges or threats that emanate from the South? And there's a whole array of things to talk about. And it won't surprise you to hear that our southern member states, from Portugal and Spain to Greece and Turkey to Italy, a whole array of countries want to see the alliance fortify its initiatives and policies in this particular area. So late last year, we appointed a group of experts, a small group of policymakers and academics with deep experience in handling some of those southern challenges. And they just recently came to the NATO alliance and presented us with over 100 different ideas of what the alliance could do to move out and strengthen its deterrence and defense, and the way in which it protects its southern flank. Now, NATO is in the middle of debating those over 100 recommendations, and there's a lot of good ideas there. There are small things, and there are bigger, more ambitious initiatives, but between now and July, the allies are going to have to settle on just a handful of initiatives that will enable us to deliver on something for the South. And as I noted also earlier, there's 2 chief threats that we're facing inside the NATO alliance: Russia and terrorism. And so we want to ensure that NATO continues to do good work in both of those spaces, fortifying its deterrence and defense to counter both of those threats. So I don't want to get into where the U.S. position is on those 100+ recommendations. I really can't get into the details of that because we are literally right in the middle of debating all of those good recommendations. But you're right to note that the alliance will have something more to say about its southern flank. And the reason I think that's important, I think why the Secretary General thinks it's important, is to showcase to any would-be adversary or actor that we are prepared for all contingencies. This is an alliance that can, as the old adage goes, walk and chew gum at the same time. And so, as I said, NATO is addressing what's happening in Ukraine, but simultaneously moving out on an array of new initiatives. On the sanctions question, I mean, again, NATO doesn't take on sanctions per se. This is not part of our chief work strand inside the alliance, so I'm hesitant to get into it. I will say that we believe that the unprecedented sanctions that both Europe and the United States have imposed since the start of the war has had an impact. There are instances where we see evasion, and we continue to work with our closest partners in Europe through the G7, through the US-EU relationship and other bilateral relationships to get at the heart of that, to prevent it from happening. And it remains a key feature of what we work on with our transatlantic partners. But we believe the sanctions that have been put on the table since the war started have left the Russians with $400 billion less than they would have normally to put towards this military operation. And the fact that the Russians are now turning to countries like the DPRK or Iran or the PRC for capabilities and technology says a lot about what the West has been able to do to shut off the flow of potential components that could help them pursue this war.
By the way, the DPRK artillery, we're hearing upwards of half of it are duds. Is this what you are?
There are instances where we see a significant level of what they provided actually not working. No.
Two more here, and then I think that may bring us to the end. If we can make the questions very short and crisp, we're running down on time a little bit.
Hi, my name is Alexander Mallinckrodt. I'm an undergraduate here at the SFS. My question is to do with defense procurement. Europe has stated its desire in EDIS and EDIP last month to increase its role in defense procurement, but one of the issues that European member states have is that while they procure to NATO standards, they each apply their national requirements onto those procurements. So 13 different national variants of Leopard 2 tanks, which restricts supply chains, NATO logistics, ability to mobilize and fight together. I was wondering how NATO is approaching not just expanding the defense industrial base and procurement, but also seeking to better align capabilities to reduce those sort of stepping on each other's feet. Thank you.
Okay, and one more question there.
Hi, my name is Brad Morath. I'm a historian with the Office of the Historian, Department of State. Question is, the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2022. What impact did it have with U.S. relations with other NATO allies? And was there an impact here regarding intelligence sharing in the months lead up to the start of the war in Ukraine regarding U.S. intelligence sharing with allies? Thank you.
So on that question, you'll remember that I mentioned that I was confirmed in late November of 2021. So I actually was here at the State Department serving as a senior advisor to Secretary Blinken throughout most of 2021. I was not inside the NATO alliance at the time during the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and I feel like I'm probably not the best person positioned to talk about that. On the question of fragmentation across Europe's industrial base and the associated challenges that we're seeing as a result of underinvestment over many decades, I mean, this is a challenge that NATO is going to have to work on very closely with the European Union. And we were pleased to see the European Union recently roll out a European defense industrial strategy. It's a very interesting piece of work that very clearly articulates the challenges that Europe faces for the foreseeable future when it comes to building up its defense industrial base and getting at duplication, some of the challenges, the fragmentation that were mentioned by the individual that asked the question. We do, however, want to ensure that as the European Union thinks about taking on a variety of new initiatives to build out defense production and build capacity, that it relies on NATO standards. The last thing we want to see is for the European Union to establish its own set of standards. We would then have situations where countries are looking at their own national standards and requirements. They're looking at what NATO's delivering in terms of what's mandated through NATO membership. And then there would be a new aspect to it with the European Union potentially putting a different set of standards on the table. So the European Union is reassuring us that they will rely on NATO standards. We want to keep it that way. And we also want to encourage our friends in the European Union, at least in the short term, as they look to build out capacity and address some of those shortfalls that we addressed at the top, that it continues to look at non-EU member states for ways to backfill. Now, I understand why the European Union wants to focus on EU members and building up their defense industrial base in Europe, but we have to work together. We have to find ways to aggregate demand. We have to look at multinational solutions that will help us produce faster and get more for ourselves and into the hands of our friends in Ukraine.
Well, thank you. I've got a list of more questions, but we are running out of time. So we will have to save them for the run-up to the NATO summit or something like that. But I thank you for spending all this time, both in your prepared remarks and your very candid answers here. And I hope that we've given a good start off for what looks like a really promising and interesting day.
Thank you very much, David. And thanks all of you for coming out this morning. Thanks to Georgetown University. And I hope the rest of the day goes well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Smith and Mr. Sanger, for being with us here today. It was an honor to host you. We ask the audience to kindly remain in your seats as our speakers make their way out of Gaston. In the meantime, if you have not done so already, please submit your questions for the afternoon keynote with General Cavoli, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, using the QR codes displayed on the screens to your left and right. I'll give you a moment to do so. We are now going to take a short break. As a reminder, bathrooms are located outside Gaston on the 1st and 4th floors of Healy Hall. For those of us joining virtually, we will return at 9:45 with our first panel. Thank you.